Alright guys, welcome to our next STAR review video. Today we'll be reviewing the Constitution and the concepts that go along with it. Okay, now before we talk about the Constitution, let's talk about our first form of government, which was the Articles of Confederation. Now remember, this was our first Constitution, or our first form of government. It was created at the Second Continental Congress at the same time as the Declaration of Independence. So we broke up with England, and then we had to create our own government since we no longer could rely on England to govern us. The problem with this government is it was very weak because it gave power to the states, but not much power to the nation. Okay, so let's look at some of the strengths and weaknesses. One of the strengths is that it had strong states' rights. It gave states most all of the rights, as a matter of fact. So a lot of the Anti-Federalists and the Southerners really liked the Articles of Confederation. Every state got an equal say. Congress met to make all the decisions. Okay, now let's look at the weaknesses, which obviously you can see there are more of. Okay, first of all, there were no national taxes. So they can't pay for anything. If they don't collect taxes as a national government, they can't pay off war debt, and they can't buy anything for the government. Also, there was no court system, so they can't settle problems between states. Obviously, states, kind of like teenagers, have problems, or they get into arguments. And when this happens, there was no court system to settle these arguments. They just had to settle it themselves. Think about you trying to settle your argument with another 8th grader. Obviously, that's not going to work out too well unless you have an adult around to help mediate this argument. There was no federal government, okay? And by that I meant there was no executive or president. Okay, so there was a very weak central government. They couldn't regulate trade, and so they couldn't regulate who the states traded with. And also there was a limited military, so we were very weak under the Articles of Confederation. Now, the Articles of Confederation showed their weakness when Shays' Rebellion happened. Okay, remember this was a rebellion by many farmers. These farmers got together, rebelled against the government, and they almost overthrew the government. So now, if farmers are overthrowing your government, you know it's weak. And so we had to come up with a new type of government. Okay, and so this led to the Constitutional Convention. We decided, hey, we need to amend the Articles of Confederation. Okay, remember, amend means to change. So the convention was called in 1787. Remember, we talked about this last unit. George Washington was the head of this convention. Okay? And we called this to just change or amend the Articles of Confederation, but the father of the Constitution, James Madison, introduced a new plan. And this plan was an entirely new form of government. He said our new government should have a strong executive branch to replace the weak Articles of Confederation. He also said that we should have a one-branch legislature or Congress based on population. Well, I see a problem here. What about the small states? Are they going to be happy that the larger states have more power? Well, probably not. So let's see how they deal with that issue. Okay, with the Constitutional Convention, there came some compromising. All right, all these men were gathered together trying to form a new government, and they were having problems. And so anytime you have problems, it's best to compromise. And so they came up with two different compromises at the Constitutional Convention. The first was the Great Compromise. Okay, and this combined the New Jersey and Virginia plans to not only create a one-house legislature that we just talked about, but a two-house legislature. The two houses were the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Representatives would be based on population, so this would please the large states. The Senate would have an equal number of representatives for every state, so this would please the small states. Okay, so you can see how this compromise pleased both the small and large states when determining representation in Congress. Secondly, we had the 3/5 compromise. Okay, slavery was still an issue at this time, but we did not want to address this issue. We did not want to try to abolish slavery while creating the Constitution, because then obviously the southern states would not ratify or approve the Constitution. So we came up with a compromise for counting slaves in determining a representation of a state. Southerners wanted to count slaves as full people for representation, so that their states would be bigger. Northern states said we should not count slaves because they didn't want the South to have a bigger population. So the compromise was that slaves would count as 3/5 of a person for representation and taxation purposes. Now, don't ask me how they came up with 3/5, but it's somewhere in the middle of them not counting and them counting as a full person. This was the 3/5 compromise. So next, let's talk about the groups that were fighting over ratification of the Constitution. These were the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Now, the major leaders of the Federalists were Alexander Hamilton, who would eventually create the National Bank, and James Madison, who we just saw as the father or the creator of the Constitution. Okay, the Federalists, like you hear in their name, federal means national. They wanted a strong national or central government. They also wrote the Federalist Papers for the Constitution. These were propaganda encouraging people to approve or ratify the Constitution. Then we have the Anti-Federalists. Okay, remember, anti means against. And so these people were against a strong national government. Their major leaders were Patrick Henry, who remember was involved in the American Revolution, and George Mason. They wanted a weak central government. They also wanted a Bill of Rights included to make sure that this new strong national government would not take away our individual rights. They wrote the Anti-Federalist Papers against the Constitution. Okay, remember the Bill of Rights gives us our individual rights. Now, they were included in the Constitution to please the Anti-Federalists. This compromise allowed the Constitution to be ratified. The Bill of Rights are modeled after England's Bill of Rights. And like I said, it gives us our individual rights. Alright guys, so let's talk about the 10 amendments that are part of the Bill of Rights. Remember, the Bill of Rights give us our individual rights. So let's look at these. First of all, we have the First Amendment. And remember, this is freedom of speech. Okay, we use this hand signal to signify that. Okay, and remember, speech doesn't have to be me just talking. It can also be me writing something. So if I write something bad about our president and send it to him, I can't be arrested for that. I'm protected under this amendment. Secondly, under the First Amendment, we're also protected with freedom of religion. We can practice any religion we like. We have freedom of the press, so if I publish something in a newspaper, then I'm protected under the First Amendment as long as I'm not lying. And then freedom of assembly. We have the freedom to gather with people and assemble or talk, okay, whether it be friends or otherwise. Okay, our Second Amendment right is right to bear arms. Remember, this is our hand signal showing right to have a gun. Okay, our Third Amendment is no quartering of troops. Okay, remember, this is our hand signal right here. 1, 2, 3, Third Amendment. And this means I don't have to house soldiers if I don't want to. Our Fourth Amendment right is no illegal search and seizures. You must have a warrant. So if someone is going to search me, they have to have probable cause and they have to have a warrant. And so this is the hand signal, 1, 2, 3, 4, showing warrant W for the Fourth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment right is right to due process. So we have the right to be told that we did something wrong. Okay, this is due process of law. We also have the right not to be tried twice for the same crime. This is called double jeopardy. And finally, this amendment protects us against self-incrimination. If we go to court, we don't have to testify against ourselves. Remember, we saw this in the Dave Chappelle video when he says, I plead the Fifth. And remember, this is our hand signal for the Fifth Amendment. Okay, I don't have to talk. I don't have to incriminate myself at a trial. Okay, moving up to the Sixth Amendment. This is a speedy public trial and right to a lawyer. So if I'm accused of something and I go to court, I always have the right to have a lawyer, no matter what. Okay? And remember, our hand signal to show speedy trial is 4 fingers, 2 fingers, and then right there, speedy trial. Okay? And then our Seventh Amendment right is a right to a trial by jury in all cases. Okay? And trial by jury, remember, is 4, 3, and there's my jury box. Okay? Trial by jury. Our Eighth Amendment right is no cruel and unusual punishment. Okay? So if I steal something, you can't chop my thumbs off. And so that's how we show this. I have 8 fingers here, chop my thumbs off. No cruel and unusual punishment. Okay, they also can't throw me in jail for life for stealing a candy bar from the store. Okay, our Ninth Amendment is rights of the people that are there. Okay, even though they're not listed, we have extra rights besides these rights that we've talked about. And so we use this hand signal to represent this. Okay, I have rights that I can't see. Okay, and then our 10th Amendment is rights not given to the federal government goes to the state government. This makes sure that our federal government has limited power. This makes sure that the state governments have some power as well. And so remember, we use 10th Amendment, 10 fingers right here, and we say state, nation, okay? Both have some rights. They share the rights together. Okay, now let's talk about grievances or complaints from the Declaration of Independence and how we address these complaints in the Constitution. Okay, so Declaration of Independence versus the Constitution. Here are the grievances or the complaints we had against England and against the king. First of all, he taxed us without representation. So to address this in the Constitution, we made sure that our representatives, the people who represent us in Congress, are the ones who set the taxes. Second of all, the king had absolute power. That was another complaint we had. So to make sure this didn't happen, we have checks and balances as one of our principles of the Constitution. And so a president, if he vetoes something, he can be overridden by Congress. And so he does not have full power. Third, colonists are not allowed to speak against the king. This was another complaint we had. And so this is allowed by the First Amendment. We put this in the Bill of Rights that if we want to complain, we have freedom of speech. Fourth, we had to quarter troops when we were the colonies. And so our Third Amendment states that we no longer have to quarter troops if we don't want to. Next, the king allowed illegal search and seizures. He allowed British soldiers to come into the colonists' homes and search them without a warrant. So we created the Fourth Amendment, where now we can no longer be searched illegally. And last, we had no trial by jury of our peers under the king's rule. And so the Sixth and Seventh Amendments give us the right to a trial by jury. Okay, so this is how we address the grievances from the Declaration of Independence when we wrote the Constitution. Okay, let's talk about the 7 principles of government that go along with the Constitution. These things are true to our Constitution. And our first one is popular sovereignty. Remember, popular people, they both start with the same letter. Popular sovereignty means people are the source of the government's power. We vote. We run for office. People are allowed to speak their voice. This is how we control our government. If I don't like what's going on, I can vote for someone else. In fact, I can run for president if I want to. Our next principle of government is republicanism. Okay, and republicanism means people elect their political representatives. So we elect our president. We elect our Congress members. Okay, and so what you need to think about when you think of republicanism is voting to elect representatives. Next, we have a limited government. Okay, it's very self-explanatory. It means the Constitution limits the action of the government by specifically listing the powers it does and does not have. The government cannot take away our individual rights. The government cannot do anything it wants. The government has to follow the same laws and Constitution that we do. Next, we have federalism. Remember that word federal means national. We've talked about that a bunch this year. In this government system, power is divided between the national and state governments. Okay? So here's a couple powers of the nation. They can collect taxes. They can regulate health care. A couple powers of the state is they can regulate marriage. They can also regulate education, hence us taking the STAR test, which is a Texas test. No one else in the nation takes this test because Texas regulates its own education. Separation of powers is another principle of the Constitution. Each of the 3 branches of government has its own responsibilities. The executive branch carries out the laws. Okay, this is why the president is commander-in-chief. Okay, he carries out all the laws. Now, the people who make the laws are the legislative branch. And then the judicial branch interprets the laws. Okay, and we'll talk more about judicial review coming up. And then we have checks and balances as another principle of the Constitution. This is where each branch of government holds some control over the other 2 branches. Okay, so it's really important that you study this graphic here because this is directly what the checks and balances of our government is. Okay, so if we look at an example here, okay, the judicial branch, the court can declare a law unconstitutional. Okay, but the way the legislative branch has control over the judicial branch is that the Senate confirms nominations of judges. And so, if you want to be a judge, you have to be nominated by the president and confirmed by the legislative branch. So you can see that powers are separated, and then each different branch checks each other's powers. And then we have individual rights. This is very easy to remember, okay? What gives us our individual rights? Of course, the Bill of Rights does. And so these are basic liberties and rights of all citizens that are guaranteed in the Bill of Rights. Okay, so let's talk about how we amend or change the Constitution. Our forefathers created the Constitution knowing that we would probably need to change it along the way. They knew that as our society grew, as time passed, we would need to allow a process for changing the Constitution. As people change, their government needs to change with them. So we made the amendment process, or the change process. Okay, here's how the process works. To propose an amendment, 2/3 of Congress or 2/3 of the states have to want to make a change. So if 2/3 of these people don't want to make a change, then we can't have an amendment. Then to get it ratified or approved, 3/4 of the state legislatures have to agree. So 38 out of the 50 states have to agree that this amendment is a good change to our Constitution. Okay? So just remember, amendment means change. Change to the Constitution. Okay, let's talk about, real quickly, historical influences on the Constitution. This means what gave us the ideas that we put in the Constitution. Where did we get these ideas from? Okay, remember the first one we talked about this year was the Magna Carta. This was made in England in 1215 to limit the power of the king. Okay, and here's the activity we did, the comic strip about little Timmy getting his head chopped off by the king, and then all the nobles making the king sign this document limiting his power. Okay, and the reason this influenced our Constitution is because we decided to limit the power of our leader as well, which is the president. Okay, let's talk about another document that influenced our Constitution, the English Bill of Rights. Okay, this is a very obvious one. Obviously, their Bill of Rights influenced our American Bill of Rights. It gave the English citizens individual rights, and then the United States used England's Bill of Rights as an example when making their own. Many rights are the same. We both have trial by jury. We both have freedom of speech, and we both have no cruel and unusual punishments. Another document we've talked about this year that has influenced our Constitution is the Mayflower Compact. Remember, this is a date you have to remember. It was created in 1620 when the Pilgrims landed in Massachusetts. It established self-government, which should be a very easy word to understand. It means we govern ourselves. We make decisions for ourselves. It also established a majority rule system, so all the men would get together, vote on an issue, and if a majority decided that that issue was correct, then they would vote on it and it would become a law. Congress makes laws using the same majority rule system. Okay, so if more than half of Congress wants a law to be made, it gets made. The United States of America governs itself. Okay, and we got this idea partially from the Mayflower Compact. Citizens take part in government in America, just like citizens took part in government in the Plymouth colony under the Mayflower Compact. The Federalist Papers. Remember, these were written to convince people to ratify the Constitution. They were propaganda, meaning they were one-sided, and they argued for a strong central government. Okay, these helped influence the Constitution mainly because they helped to get it ratified. Then we have the AntiFederalist Papers. They opposed the Constitution because of no guaranteed rights included, and so they wanted strong state governments. These were very influential because they helped provide the authority to add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. That is it for today, guys, and we will continue our review tomorrow. Go ahead and make sure you take the Constitution quiz.